Welcome to episode 42 of the TheoDisc podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Innes. How do you feel when someone asks you what your desires are? Desire is a word fraught with danger in many of our Christian communities. From the first humans onwards, desire has been at the root of evil intentions and actions, and so it seems the best antidote for desire is to suppress it, to nullify it, to rid ourselves of it. But in his book, The Gift of Thorns, AJ Swoboda helps us to see that desire is actually fundamental to our humanity as God created us. The real issue is disordered desire that needs to be brought into the light of God made known in Jesus and healed. And when we feel pain and frustration around our desires, that can actually be a positive indication that we're perceiving them more in terms of what God wants than what we want. The journey is one that requires grace and patience and a dependence on Jesus to walk us towards the freedom that comes from submission to God. In our conversation, AJ shares his own experiences and wisdom, and I hope you will hear the heart of someone who has wrestled with these things and is eager to help others walk in healing and renewal. AJ Swoboda is Associate Professor of Bible and Theology at Bushnell University in Oregon, USA, and is lead mentor for the Doctor of Ministry program on Spiritual Formation and Soul Care at Friends University. He holds a PhD from Birmingham University here in the UK, and is the author of multiple books including Subversive Sabbath, After Doubt, and the book that forms the basis for today's conversation, The Gift of Thorns. He also hosts the Slow Theology podcast with Nijay Gupta, and writes the widely read Low-Level Theologian Substack, for which you can find the links in our show notes. I do hope you enjoy this conversation around desire. Well, Dr. AJ Swoboda, thank you for being on the TheoDisc podcast. It's great to have you.
Are you kidding me? It's an absolute joy to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, good. So you are talking to me all the way from Oregon on the northwest coast of the US, so we're about 8 hours apart.
Mm-hmm.
As we speak, I'm slightly jet lagged after returning from a summer vacation in Colombia, and you are about to head to the Netherlands.
Yeah, we are in different time zones. We both have travailed travel and challenges to get here, but we've arrived, Ken.
There we go.
And yes, indeed, I'm tomorrow actually going to be in the Netherlands with my family. I'm speaking at a conference out there. And it's been a couple days in Amsterdam. And so, yes, I'll be closer to you than I am now, but I unfortunately won't be making it to the Great Isles of England, Scotland. So unfortunately, it's not quite where you're at.
Next time.
Next time.
There's a WTC space for you. You come and hang out with us.
Yes, love it.
Well, listen, we're going to spend some time today just talking through some of the themes of your book, The Gift of Thorns. But before we get to that, AJ, I like to spend some time before we start theologizing.
Yes.
Spend some time just getting to know our guests a little bit, first-time guests. And so the way we do that is just through me asking you 3 questions about things that are constants or that you return to in your life.
Yes.
So there are 3 categories I'd like you to consider. The first is a book that you return to. The second is a meal or a kind of food that you return to.
Yes.
And the third is a place or location that you return to. So, first off, a book, and let's just get out of the way. You can't Jesus juke me and say the Bible or anything like that. It's something other than the scriptures.
Yeah. And that's, we would call that a Jesus juke.
Yes.
Okay, so we won't do that. Well, actually, yeah, a little quiet book that... I swear the author I owes me more money than anybody. I have pressed this book for years. Nobody reads it. It is hands down unbelievable. A book by a New Testament scholar named Thomas Schmidt. He wrote a book called A Scandalous Beauty, and it's a book about the artistry of the cross. And I think still today on Amazon, it's sitting at about the 2 million mark for Amazon sellers list. So meaning it doesn't sell a lot, but every person I know who reads it emails me and thanks me for turning them onto it. It is the most beautiful book ever written about Christology. Absolutely incredible.
All right. I need to add it to my Amazon list.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yep.
And then I'll email you probably and say, I can't believe I never read that.
You're welcome. In advance. Indeed.
Okay, the second question is about a food or a meal that you return to.
I have a pretty soft spot in my heart for a good pad thai.
Mm.
Which American pad thai is very different than Thai pad thai. But I just love what Americans have done with pad thai. It's just fabulous. So American pad thai is a pretty good go-to for me. Having never been to Thailand, I can't compare it, but I'm told that it's very different, and I'm uh, yes. So American pad thai.
And finally, a place or a location that you return to.
Mm. I have a yes, I have a chair in my living room
Mm.
where I spend the mornings with God, and it is probably the location that I spend most of my time in the mornings. I love this chair. My wife refurbished it.
Mm.
And I think she refurbished it for herself, but I'm the one that occupies it more often than not. So I love that chair. It's a fabulous chair. It's my God, it's my Jesus chair. Yeah.
You stole the chair and made it your God spot.
Yeah. So just as America has done that to pad thai, I've done it to the chair. That's right.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, AJ. Great to kind of just hear a little bit about you before we start talking.
You're welcome.
I think, the primary theme of your book, The Gift of Thorns, is about the sense of desire,
Mm.
how we connect with desire, how we relate to desire. And as I was reading through it, a couple of things came to my mind. Certainly, personally, as a Scotsman, the expression of desire or want is not something that we generally engage with well. You've got the kind of stiff upper lip of the British culture, and then you take Scotland as a nation within the UK, and you add in our kind of Calvinist Presbyterian work ethic in the back of that. And so
Yes.
I was just reflecting on my own personal journey, how that somehow seems to be deeply embedded within me. The denial of saying this, yes, I
Mhm.
like that,
Mhm.
or I would like that,
Mhm.
is hard.
Yeah.
And then the second thing was that as I was on vacation with my wife, we were talking about that one of our favorite places in the world is a place in London called the Barbican, which is kind of a brutalist estate, kind of a utopian designed place, with an art centre and a beautiful library and restaurants and all this. And
Mm.
you can buy apartments there and they cost like £1 million. And I was just expressing this deep desire to live in a place like that, but also the recognition that we will never own, unless inflation keeps going like it does, we will never own £1 million house. And I was saying to her how heartbroken that made me feel, and then I realized in the same breath, but actually you have a home, and you have all you have all that you need, really. And so I thought that desire is a bit silly. All this to say, reading your book made me think about the complexity of desire, how it's
Mhm.
expressed, not expressed, what it's connected to. It is complex, isn't it?
Very complex. Yes. I guess to hitch my wagon to yours, Kenny, one of the things that has come about since the writing of The Gift of Thorns, as I've talked about it and taught on it and lectured on it and whatnot, is this renewed awareness that I have always hated my birthday.
Hmm.
Not like it's an inconvenience sort of way.
Sure.
It is literally, I mean, I often get depressed on my birthday.
Hmm.
I have struggled to not want to live on my birthday.
Wow.
And it has taken me years to kind of reflect on why this is the case. And there's two core reasons. The first is when I was a child, um, I um, I can only recall one time having a birthday party for myself. And when I think about having a birthday party today, I get really clammy because if I threw a birthday party, my fear would be that no one would come. So there's this fear of like not being seen or loved. But the real and the second one is that I don't know how to answer the question, what do you want? Like I don't know what to say.
Right.
And the pressure, what do you want, actually creates this really odd um pressure for me to have to
Hmm.
produce some sort of desire for this to be a day that and I think what that exposes not just for me. I think I actually, as I've told that story, multiple people have reached out and said, I hate my birthday for the same reason,
Yeah.
is we don't know what we want.
Yeah.
We are unable to discover, name, and clarify what we want. In fact, I mentioned this in the book. I was in conversation with a financial planner who was telling me how he can get people to save millions and millions of dollars. He's brilliant at what he does. That's never the problem. The problem is when people save their money, they don't know what to do with it once they have it. They don't know how, they don't actually know what they want with it.
Right.
And in at least in my writing, I describe a kind of disability of desire that I have, where I
Mm.
don't. It's almost like there's a part of me that A, doesn't know what I want. Number two, doesn't know how to name it. And number three, sees desire almost as a bad thing. There's this sort of lingering sense that certainly does not come from the Bible, but there's this lingering sense that like to want stuff is bad or something like that. So in a way, I really identify actually what you're saying
Yeah.
about being a Scot who doesn't know what he wants, and Presbyterianism has shoved those desires down for years. I really identify with that. I don't. I almost never know what I want, and it's almost always a huge victory in my family when I can say, "Hey, I want pad thai." Like that's a huge win for my
Yeah.
family.
Yeah. Yeah. Now this is tricky, right, for those of us who are trying to follow Jesus, because
Yeah,
he seems to regularly ask the question, "What do
yeah.
you want?"
Yeah. There's a brilliant scholar, New Testament scholar, by the name of Conrad Gump, who wrote a book called Jesus Asked question mark. And there are, I think in total, something like 300 questions that God asks in the Bible. That actually, God asks humans way more questions than humans ask God. And
Mm.
the very first words of God to the first humans in Genesis 3 is, "Where are you?"
Right.
It's a question.
Yeah.
Where are you? Of all the questions Jesus asked, which I think he asked 156 of them, or he was asked 156 of them, only two of them he gives substantive answers to. Like he gives a clear, concise answer to. Most of often than not, he doesn't answer the question and he asks a question back. But the most repeated question Jesus asks, of all the questions Jesus asks, the most repeated question is he asks, "What do you want?"
Mm.
And I think that repetitive. I mean, why would he ask such a question? By the way, is he ignorant of people's wants? He knows what they want.
Sure.
It's not an issue of his ignorance. It's not an issue of he. There are multiple times in the Gospels when Jesus can read people's minds and hearts. He knows what's going on. He knows what people want. The issue is, I think Jesus is helping us awaken so that we can name what we want, and that's a win for God.
Yeah.
Not by the way, not that all of our desires are good. That's not what I think Jesus is after there. But there is something holy about the sanctification process when a person who is following Jesus has the capacity to be in touch with what they really, really want.
Already this conversation feels a little dangerous because I think in our Western evangelical culture of the last 30 years, certainly if you grew up in youth groups in the 90s and
Mm-hmm.
noughties,
Yeah.
we were really focused more on this is what you should not want.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right, so desire, this idea of
Mm-hmm.
desire in our church culture, I think is something that is really kind of been repressed. Not always out of awful intentions, but yeah.
I mean, we want to be careful here, and I want to be very clear about that. We want to be very careful because
Yep.
our cultural moment, would say little clever statements like "you do you" or whatnot, which is basically
Yeah.
a really popularized street version of if you want it, take it. I mean, you're not going to die. Eat what you want. You do you. You live forever. There's no judgment. You do you, which is oddly similar to the words of the serpent in Genesis 3 to the man and the woman. Eat from the tree, you won't die, you'll be like God, this sort of stuff. So we want to be careful here because this is not the problem with "you do you" is, and I know myself very well, my desires on Monday morning are very different than my desires on Friday night.
Sure.
And if you're going to tell me to do you, well, which you are we talking about? Because I change a lot. I have very fickle desires. And Lord have mercy, the Christian way does not tell you to follow the desires du jour like that you have. Like you need a deeper, what I describe as a cruciform desire, a Christ-centered
Yep.
desire. But to your point, um, I think largely after the purity movement in the 1980s, 1990s, the lasting impression has been that for example, all sexual desire is evil, bad, and wrong, and we should constantly crucify the desires of human sexuality, entirely failing to recognize that these desires that we have, human sexual godly desires, were created by God. The very creation of the humans in Genesis 2 to be fruitful and multiply comes with the desire. I mean, I know this sounds really silly, but a theology of the orgasm, it's a really interesting conversation, because that pleasure, the release of a sexual experience, is designed by God.
Yeah.
Like that pleasure is a creation of our creator. The orgasm is not a mistake, and it is not a feature of an evolutionary glitch. It was created by God. We were made to enjoy sexual union. But the problem becomes when um, when we make sexual desire a bad thing in our efforts to get people to stop looking at pornography. And so what we do is we conflate evil sexual desire with good sexual desire. And the minute we do that, Samuel Perry is a writer who's written a lot on these issues. Is basically we teach young people how to eat well by only teaching them about food poisoning.
Right.
And so what we do is we end up like forming people around the fear of the sin rather than the good side.
Yeah.
And the resulting, I think, impression, Kenny, as you're getting to, is the sense of, well, all sexual desire is bad. We got to remember, the New Testament never tells us to crucify our desire. We are told to crucify the flesh. And there is a difference between good and godly desire and the flesh. They are not the same thing.
So let's push this back a little bit further then, and I think we'll come to this flesh issue and how we deal with that.
Yeah.
But it seems that what you're saying in the book, a large part of it is that actually the desires that we experience are rooted in the fact that we are created by a God who desires.
Bingo.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Jacob Boehme was a German pietist renewal pastor. He was a brilliant pietist pastor in the 1600s. And when he looked at all of creation, okay, he looked at everything that had been made, the trees, the stars, mango, the sunset. He looked at it and he said, everything is here. Everything is here because God wanted it. And he literally describes creation as the concentration of God's desire. That is to say, God did not create because he was forced to. God did not create because he was lonely. God did not create because he was a divine narcissist looking for people to worship him. He created because he desires. He's a God of love who loves to make stuff. He didn't do it out of deficit. He did it out of love. And so we are desiring creatures because we were created by a desiring God, in as much as we have emotions, because the God of the Bible has emotions. So this is a reflective element of the image of God in human beings. In fact, Balthazar, I never say his full name. I just say Balthazar because
I hear you.
hate trying to pronounce his first three names. But Balthazar has this beautiful section in one of his books where he talks about how when God creates the humans in the Garden of Eden, when God creates the humans, it's very interesting to note the difference between the way in which God created the humans from the animals on day 6. Because when God creates the animals, he creates them in pairs at the same exact moment. So the male and the female creature were created in pairs at the same exact moment together. And they were told to be fruitful and multiply. They're actually told to do that before the humans are created, which seems to imply that animals have a relationship with God and are called to obey God, which is a whole nother conversation. But when God creates the humans in Genesis 2, he does it in a different order because he actually creates the man first and then the woman second. And the man experiences aloneness. In fact, God is the one who puts the name on that. He says, it is not good for man to be alone. Adam does not use that language. God uses that language. Right. It's as though God is naming Adam's experience for him. As a good therapist would, God is naming, this is what you're going through.
Mhm.
And he's alone. And then God provides the woman. And Balthazar, in one of his reflections on Genesis 2, says that that is one of the elements of the Imago Dei that we have forgotten, is that one of the unique capacities of human beings is the capacity to experience unfulfilled desire and longing. That as Adam was made without the woman, he was meant to experience waiting for this bride that God would bring. And that capacity for longing, Balthazar says, is one of the unique components of the human story. We are created to be longing animals who are awaiting God's care and provision. Our hearts were made to long for God.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but that's beautiful. I mean, as I reflect on, why are we waiting so long for Jesus to come back?
Mm. Yeah.
He's doing something in us.
Yeah.
That it's only in waiting that we actually become able to receive the gift. That's actually, if you were to ask me, what is the greatest problem with pornography? The greatest problem with pornography is not that it has bodies in it. For heaven's sake, Song of Songs have bodies in it. Bodies are not a bad thing. Bodies are good. I think the problem with pornography, at least one of the biggest ones, is that it gives us a version of sexuality that does not require any waiting.
Yep.
And so what it creates is an immediate, a sort of compulsive, impulsive form of sexuality that does not require any waiting. And so what that does is our impulse becomes our action, and we no longer know how to stop and breathe and trust in God who's going to provide for us.
And so this is the wider issue then of the disordering of our desires, because I think what you said, there's this sense of longing is ultimately fulfilled by what God provides or by God himself.
Yeah.
And yet as humans, it feels like we're really good at fulfilling that provision ourselves in ways that we think are good.
Kenny, this is an interesting, I love being with fellow theology nerds. It's an interesting question. When God created the man alone, was that a mistake? Like, did God create the man and then afterwards be like, well, I've clearly missed something.
Right.
I've got to make something else. Or was Adam's experience of having an unfulfilled desire part of God's divine purpose? I think I would stand with, I suspect, Kenny, we're on the same page here, that God knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that humans are created. Actually, the Western world is trying to create a world where there are no unfulfilled desires, which is a world better than the one God created. Like, we're trying to create a world that we think is better than the one God created.
Yeah.
God's good creation does not give us what we want immediately. And I think God is brilliant in that. He is always doing stuff in the waiting. He is always doing stuff in the waiting, which in the Bible even, it is often in the waiting that people create their idols. It's when Moses is up on the mountain and taking too long that they create the idol down below. We usually make our idols in the waiting.
Yeah.
But God wants to use the waiting of those unfulfilled desires as the place where he's most shaping us. And this, goodness gracious, how does this not apply to the single person who's longing for marriage, the parents who want children who can't have kids yet? That God might actually be doing something in the middle of those seasons of unfulfilled desire.
And I think that's really a really important part of the book, because you talk about the sense that the unfulfilled desire is often a good thing. That if we are actually left to our own desires, and if we received everything that we desired that we wanted, that's going to be problematic, particularly if our desires are as disordered as they are. I've got this little quote that you say, "Life after Eden is a world littered with thorns and thistles. We all have desires that we didn't plant in the garden of our lives. We seem unable to permanently rid ourselves of them. And while we may seek to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit and a life of virtue, it often feels as though weeds keep growing throughout our lives." There's a tension for those who are following Jesus, who have this sense of the desire to be like him, and also we still seem to be in some way, hostage is maybe not the right word, but certainly our fleshly desires are still at play and at work. it would be great if we just had faith in Jesus and just everything was sorted out right there and then.
Ah, yes. Yeah, no doubt. One of the things I explore in the book just a little bit is this document in the early church called the Shepherd of Hermas, which was actually almost included in the New Testament by a number of writers. They a number of the kind of post-apostolic writers felt that it was worthy of recognition to such a degree that it should be canonized. Of course, it wasn't, but it should be a second tier reading for us. I mean, it really is a beautiful text. But one of the simmering ideas behind this book is that very early on in the Christian community, there was this question, well, what do we do with our sin after we become Christians? Like, is there forgiveness for sin after we are baptized? And actually, this is why St. Augustine in the 4th century was not baptized until his deathbed. Or excuse me, Constantine was not baptized until his deathbed because he was afraid that he didn't want to sin after baptism.
Right.
So there's this simmering sense of like, is there forgiveness after baptism? And the brilliance of the Shepherd of Hermas is all about God's mercy and grace for sin after baptism. It's one of the main themes of that, which basically is its way of saying, like, if there's grace before we're saved, there's grace after we're saved. And it's
Right.
that is wildly important for people who gave their life to Christ and experience same-sex desire. Or experience unwanted sexual desires, or experience jealousy, discontent. And they wake up the next day after their baptism, and all of a sudden they're in the same body they were before. And they go like, well, why didn't the baptism fix this? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of individuals that experience those realities can tend to be very bastardized as though they're not really saved or something like that, which is absolutely ludicrous.
Right.
I've been I'm 43 years old. I'm doing a swan dive into my midlife crisis, Kenny, and I'll tell you right now, I met Jesus at 16 years old.
Yeah.
I'm 43 years old. And the same thorns in my side that I had at 16 years old are in my side today. The only difference is I know how to walk with them faithfully, and they have made me a humble person. And I wish I could say they just all went away, but they didn't. And God has actually used them in me to make me a man of prayer. I mean, Paul literally in 2 Corinthians talks about the thorn in his side, and he's prayed to Jesus, take it away, multiple times. Jesus does not take it away. He says, Jesus won't take this away from me. And then he says, God has let this be in my life so that I would not be conceited.
Yeah.
And what he said, we don't know what the thorns are, but we know that it is accomplishing something in Paul's life.
And they won't go away by saying they're not there.
Yes, he names them. That's right. He names them.
Right. And so this question that Jesus is consistently asking us, what do you want, is, I think, in some ways an invitation to confession, right? It's not it's not Jesus saying, give me the right answer.
Yes.
It's saying, let's talk about what's in your heart.
Yes.
Because when we bring that to the Lord, I think that's at least the beginning point, or when we bring it to one another.
Yes.
Where God's presence is among us, that's at least the beginning point of saying, this is what is here.
Yes.
And I'm bringing this because actually my overriding desire is to become like him, even though I'm experiencing these disordered desires still in my present person.
Yes. In any person's life who longs to see their desires healed. And that what an interesting idea, the healing of desire. Is that a possibility? Like,
right.
Can God heal our desires? And I argue in the book he can. And it usually takes a lifetime, and it doesn't happen as quick as we want. But if the hands of the great physician are allowed to heal our desires, the only way that is possible is we have to be willing to let the great physician into those desires. A very powerful practice for somebody who wrestles with an unwanted desire, a desire that they wish they didn't have, whatnot, is the practice of confession. And confession it always has two sides to it. There's in the New Testament scope of things. In 1 John 1, John says, that we confess to God, and He is always faithful and just to purify us from all unrighteousness and sin. So there's one form forgiveness. There's one form of confession that's about forgiveness, but that's not the only kind of confession. The book of James, chapter 5, talks about confessing sins one to another. And he says, when you do that, he does not say you will be forgiven. He says you'll be healed. And the healing of actually having confessional partners that we can name stuff to, that is our way of inviting the work of God into those deep desires. We need a safe environment to name our deepest, darkest desires and find grace no matter what. Unfortunately, for most Protestants, we only do the first type of confession and not the second, which means that we're forgiven, but we don't experience healing. And as somebody who pays my therapist a lot of money, I am pro therapy. But I will tell you right now, Kenny, that I think that largely the church has neglected its ministry of James 5 confession, and we've created an entire industry to have to make up for it because we don't have, in the community of faith, we almost never have. It's very difficult to cultivate those kind of confessional spaces. But man, are they desperately needed, desperately needed.
And this sense of confession, I think, leads into, I'll quote the Scott that you quote, Thomas Chalmers, who said, he talks about dispossessing
Yes.
the heart of our old affections
Yes.
with new ones. Like this idea of dispossessing our heart
Yeah.
of what we sense should not be there.
Yes.
Is a very powerful step
Yep.
towards what you call bending our wills towards Jesus.
Yeah. Somebody said this to me yesterday, and it's been sitting with me for 24 hours. He said the problem with being really productive is that it creates more time to be more productive. And and his point was, you can, through productivity apps, create more time and space for you to do things. Well, the problem is that just creates more time for more productivity. You have to fill your time with something else for the productivity to actually have a point. We could tell somebody, hey, don't have these desires. We could tell somebody, rid yourself of these desires over and over and over again. But unless we fill the absence in the vacuum with a new desire, then the human heart cannot work it's not a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Or I should say it's a vacuum. It has to have something that fills it.
Right.
So if we're going to stop one desire, we must fill it with another desire. We can't just empty ourselves and not fill ourselves up. We must be full of some new desire. Cultivating those good and godly desires should always go alongside repenting desires that are fleshly, and that the two go hand in hand. We don't just stop. We also must cultivate the good desires at the same time.
Can we return to that word cruciform as a way that we progress forward in this journey towards Christ-likeness as it relates to our desires?
Yes. So I think I'll close with this idea of cruciform desire, which is the idea of having desires that are shaped like Christ's desires, or shaping our desires around the person of Christ. There was a brilliant thinker, a French philosopher, as a Christian, as a Catholic, named René Girard, whose contribution to the realm of philosophy was multi-pronged. He had a lot of stuff that he contributed, but he's known for his most discussed topic is this idea that he was in the area of desire, and he wrote about how desire is something that we often cultivate by looking at other people's desire. And that is to say that desire is sticky. When I see somebody else desire something, I begin to desire in the same way. And he described this as mimetic desire. Mimetic desire is the idea that desires are sticky, and we end up cultivating desires because we see other people desiring those same things. And this is how consumerism works, by the way. I see my neighbor have a perfectly curated lawn, and what do I start wanting? A perfectly curated lawn. Consumer culture has basically taken mimetic desire and built an entire way of life on it. Why does this matter? We become who we look at. And to develop cruciform desire cannot happen by looking at TikTok. It cannot happen by looking at American politics. Lord have mercy. It must come by actually looking at Jesus. And this is a simple commendation, but it is one that I would say is mimetically transformative. It transforms our desires. Actually take time every day to look intently into the Gospels. Because as we behold Jesus and his desires, I suspect his desires will begin to cultivate our own. But if we spend, all of our time looking at TikTok videos, we can expect our desires will follow suit. But if we cultivate attention to Jesus, I think we can equally find that mimetically our desires are going to want the same thing that Christ wanted.
And as part of that process, there will always be the longing which God has designed us for. When I was reading kind of towards the end of your book, I was really heartened by this idea that I've often thought about myself, that when I feel most distant from God, I look for the little blinking part of my heart that says, but I want you.
Yeah.
Even though I feel so far from you or unlike you, I want you. And if that little light is blinking, that little desire that's in there, then I feel like, okay, there's hope.
That's it.
There's hope in this. And I don't know if you've heard of there's a Welsh word, hiraeth. Have you heard that word?
I'm writing it down. Hiraeth?
Yeah, there's no kind of English cognate for it, but it basically means a desire to return to a place you've never been.
Oh.
So it's kind of a longing for a home that you've never fully experienced. And of course, we often talk about this, in relation to kind of whatever the kingdom in all of its fullness is going to look like. But I often think about that in terms of ourselves.
Wow.
That we have a longing to be something that we've never fully experienced, and the only place we can experience and witness it is in Jesus.
Wow.
And so we have to keep turning that longing to him, right?
Wow. A nostalgia for a place we've never been.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, is that not literally what woke C.S. Lewis up to faith?
Right.
He would describe Sehnsucht, this longing for something that he didn't have, and it was this longing for something that he didn't have.
Yeah.
I mean, what's that line he says in Mere Christianity? If there's no such thing as water, then why is everybody so thirsty?
Right.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Boy, I wish we had this conversation before I wrote the book.
But you did write the book, and I think what I would say to people is that if you have that desire to look at Jesus, then I think the book that you wrote, AJ, is a graceful and truthful companion on that journey. So I want to thank you for writing it. I really enjoyed reading it, and as you can tell, it really awoke some things in me. And so I would really encourage folks who are listening to have a read of it, because I think what you have to say is important. Just as the final thing here, I do often think about people who listen and think, like I've just expressed a minute ago, I feel so far away from having the desires that I want. What would be your kind of final encouragement to them?
I love the New Testament prayer. Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And the prayer that I would say is, there are times that you're not going to want God, and that's okay. So here's the prayer. Constantly tell Jesus, I want to want you. I want to want you. That's a dangerous prayer because God responds to it. I want to want you.
Beautiful. Well, Lord, we want to want you.
Yes.
Thank you, AJ, for being a guest on the podcast. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful time in the Netherlands.
And that you managed to do this completely overwhelmed with jet lag blows my mind, Kenny. You're really good at what you do, sir.
I appreciate you. Okay, hopefully we'll get to speak again in the future.
Thanks, Kenny.
Take care.
Well, thank you Kenny and AJ for giving us such a gracious approach to desire and pointing out that when Jesus is our main desire, all our other desires fall in line with His desires. We will definitely keep praying the prayer, Lord, I want to want you. In our next episode, Kenny will be at our biannual WTC residential, interviewing Vice Principal Ben Blackwell in front of our whole student body at the Jubilee campus of Nottingham University. We are really looking forward to this conversation and will release it while we are there. Don't miss it! Thank you for listening to episode 42 of TheoDisc. Join us next time for episode 43 with Professor Ben Blackwell coming to you nearly live from our WTC residential. Bye for now.